Hello, my name is Kacie Malone. I am a senior majoring in environmental geoscience and minoring in GIS. This fall semester, I worked on a project within the field of hydrogeology, focusing on characterizing the reactive transport and permeability reduction in etched 3D printed cores using core flooding experiments. So this project essentially consists of passing reactive fluid through some predetermined channel geometry that is etched into our core samples we are testing, and based on the geometry design, the fluids experience induced mixing within the core, causing reactions that produce precipitation. Some of the main research questions we were looking to answer based on this experimental design include observing how permeability changes in response to the injection of reactive fluids, seeing how pore and fracture network structures change in response to precipitation, and additionally to observe precipitate crystal morphology and see how it changes as injection pressure rises throughout reactive transport experiments. So ways in which we plan to answer these questions involve characterizing the precipitation patterns of the flow regimes. So this would include examining changes in the injection pressure as precipitation builds, observing any interaction between fluid and dead end / symmetry breaking regions, and also examining the crystal morphology of the precipitate that is present on our core samples. This project highlights the innovative use of 3D printed cores with etched geometries to replicate subsurface heterogeneity. So more traditional lab studies have really struggled to explore flow rate effects on reactive transport due to sample replication challenges. However, the etched designs that we have implemented into the 3D printed cores that we use sort of closely have been able to mimic fractured rock cores. And we can see this in the comparison between our images on the slide here, how similar these etched designs are and how we're able to replicate them in 3D printed cores. And so this therefore makes 3D printed cores effective proxies for studies such as the one that is being presented here. Specific advantages to using 3D printed cores include that they are highly replicable, they are easy and cheap to produce, it is very easy to control the heterogeneity of the core, and again, they are effective prototypes for etched rocks. The overall goal of using these core samples is to study flow regime impact on mixing behavior. This next slide just simply illustrates a broad overview of the experimental setup present in the lab, and we are first going to take a deep dive into the injection pumps. So for this project, we were targeting the precipitation of calcium carbonate and therefore chose a dual injection of two different diluted concentrations, one being 6 millimolar of sodium carbonate and the other being 6 millimolar of calcium chloride. Flow rate was chosen based upon calculations of Reynolds and Peclet numbers, where traditionally a Reynolds number above 1 is representative of inertial flow and a higher Peclet number corresponds with more advective dominant flows. Therefore, we chose a rate of 5 milliliters per minute to represent an inertial flow regime with advection dominant. From the injection pumps, fluid is next pumped into the core holder system and directly injected into our sample cores. So this bottom left image shows a close-up of the core holder with the schematic above it detailing its interior. The core sample, which is indicated by the blue rectangle, is placed inside a rubber sleeve where metal spacers are then used to fill in the extra space of the sleeve. Reactive fluids then enter in through these inlet ports, where it is able to interact with the etched geometry. So this diagram on the right here shows a close-up view of the etched geometry and channel design that was present on our 3D printed cores that we used. So as you can see, fluid begins to enter through the calcium chloride and the sodium carbonate inlet channels, both at a rate of 5 milliliters per minute. They experience induced mixing at this convergence point, and then will flow through the etched channel design, forming precipitate in regions that have fluid flux. The resulting patterns and spatial distribution of the precipitate on the core informs us more about the fluid transport in this heterogeneous structure. In this project, we conducted two different experimental runs with different shutoff parameters. So our first shutoff parameter was focusing on overpressuring, and our second parameter was time dependence. So as precipitate forms within the channels, it restricts flow paths by by decreasing the size of the channels, which increases differential pressure. And differential pressure is measured by this pressure transducer as shown in the schematic diagram. Specifically for the overpressuring test, what we ended up doing is setting a limit of 200 psi for our injection pressure limit. We would then allow the system to shut off automatically once this pressure threshold is reached. So once there is enough clogging to induce a differential pressure of above 200 psi. Our second shutoff parameter was time dependent, where we ran the experiment for a predetermined time frame, and more on this will be discussed in later slides. Final component of our system was the overburden pressure that was present in the system. So essentially what this tool does is maintains a constant confining pressure at 300 psi to condense and form the rubber sleeve around the core and spacers, essentially restricting flow around the core and directing it to enter through the inlet ports of the core to ensure it is interacting with the geometry. So as we can see with these arrows that represent overburden pressure, they are acting against the rubber sleeve, sort of forming it to be tight against the core and spacers. Therefore, when fluid enters through these injection tubes, fluid will be restricted from going around the outer edge of the core and rather be directed to go directly through the core and interact with our etched geometry. So this next graph shows the pressure transducer data for the overpressuring experiment with injection volume on the x-axis and pressure on the y-axis. Preferential flow was observed at different times throughout the experiment, which is indicated on the graph here, but the key finding was a rapid pressure increase from precipitate clogging flow paths. So this occurred at about 3 hours into the experiment, indicated by the graph on here. So right at this point marks the 3-hour mark. And this 3-hour time frame was actually used for the time dependence run, so we could exclude clogging effects on our precipitation patterns. So this next pressure curve represents the time dependence run, where the experiment was stopped again after 3 hours, instead of relying on overpressuring as our shutoff parameter. So what this graph shows is an initial gradual pressure increase, indicating that precipitation is forming, but is followed by a rapid rise near the end, suggesting that clogging was beginning and therefore marking the end of our experiment. So we could exclude the effects of clogging on our precipitation patterns specifically for this run. Here again are the precipitation results from the overpressuring experiment, so we can take a deeper dive in looking at our precipitation patterns. These images are simply high contrast images of the last slide to help the precipitation stand out more on the 3D printed core. Some key observations that we can observe is that we notice some anisotropic permeability where flow appears to be favoring the calcium chloride outlet more so than the sodium carbonate outlet, indicating that there may be some preferential flow paths within this geometry design. Additionally, we see that there is some fluid flux into these dead end regions. Basically, it is indicated by the presence of precipitate within these regions. So we can assume that fluid is interacting with these features. Although most of the precipitation is kept dominantly within the channel designs, we do see that there is slight interaction with the fracture plane for this overpressuring experimental run. And finally, we see a high precipitation density at the convergence channel of the two fluid inlets. Moving on, we can next compare our overpressuring results with our time dependence results. So again, these are high contrast images of the last side to help enhance the visibility of the precipitation that is present on these cores. Beginning with similarities, we can again notice that this this experiment also exhibits the same anisotropic permeability that was present in our overpressuring, where fluid has a preferential flow to exit through the calcium chloride outlet. We also see a high precipitation density that is present at the convergence channel where the two inlet fluids meet. We additionally see more similarities in the interaction with the dead end zones. So we do see precipitation forming in these dead end regions, indicating that fluid is interacting with the specific geometry features. Moving on to differences. So one difference is we see a lot of precipitation density forming in the inlet of the sodium carbonate channel that was not noticed in the overpressuring experiment. And we additionally see an enhanced or increased interaction with the fracture plane that is noted in this time-dependent experiment, whereas there was a lot less precipitation forming on the fracture plane in the overpressuring experiment. So upon gathering results from the overpressuring experiment, we realized that it was hard to track precipitation evolution over time because the pressures get so high that the precipitation patterns end up altering the flow field. And this ends up altering precipitation patterns. Therefore, these results are not representative of nominal precipitation patterns, and these results actually caused us to explore the time dependence results and conduct experiments without clogging having an influence on patterns. We also modeled surface reaction rates to compare simulations with our experimental results. So the reaction maps show warm colors for high activity and cool colors for low. Key observations include fluid flux and reactions in dead end zones. We also similarly see the highest precipitation at the initial fluid convergence, which directly matches our experimental results. And additionally, there is uniform precipitation throughout most of the channels, although slight reaction rate variations in the model could have likely caused anisotropic permeability in our experimental results that we saw. So these SEM results represent close-up microscopic pictures of the crystal habit forming at the outlets of the cores. In particular, both experiments have similar rhombohedral shapes in the calcium carbonate that was produced, but differ in the presence of hydrated species, which only appear to be present in the time dependence run. So this could be due to the fact that the time dependence core had less time to dry before imaging than the overpressuring core, or could be characteristic of the pressure differences between the two experiments. So this is just outlining different applications that this research can have in more real world instances. So understanding reactive transport in natural, complex, heterogeneous systems can help for efficient CO2 storage in carbon mineralization processes that are being prospected for mitigation against climate change. And in more of a general sense, this research can also be applicable to contaminant transport. So exploring transport dynamics in complex media can help professionals understand how contaminants migrate within the subsurface and allow them to track plume evolution. So looking forward at future research that is planned to enhance the results of the study, we next plan to conduct an injection run on the non-inertial flow regime. So this would mean a lower flow rate, and the goal would be to compare the precipitation patterns of the non-inertial and inertial regimes and ultimately determine what implications flow regime has on mixing behavior. Additionally, there is future plans to expand these results to future basalt core experiments. So performing reactive injection in basalt cores to help aid in understanding and how carbon mineralization processes occur in basalt systems, again, to be applied to mitigation and climate change. This last slide is here to just acknowledge a few groups and individuals who had helped with the completion of this project through their support and guidance. Thank you.